Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, first, before I really go into this video, all in all, of course, I wanted to thank all the most recent subscribers and all the most recent people who have commented on my videos, or all in all, the people that have stuck around and watched my videos, gave me feedback. I certainly appreciate you guys very, very much. Certainly, overall, helps grow the channel, and I appreciate it to a great degree. But, anyways, I also thought that before I would really go into this news, that I would kind of comment about certain changes that overall have been happening because I ended up not being able to post for the past couple of days, of course, because my cellular device, my phone, of course, that is usually the main device overall that I use in order to record videos because it's just the easiest way to do it. I ended up having to get a new phone overall because of certain problems the old one was having. So hopefully overall this one, which I believe is somewhat of a decent phone when it comes down to it, but hopefully the sound quality and hopefully the picture quality is decent, and I'll be making any changes hopefully that I need to. But just in case I may not post as much this week, it probably more than likely is because I'm still trying to figure this device out. But hopefully I'll be able to post as much as I can. But anyways, when it comes down to it, of course, I wanted to talk about this most recent news because I thought that it was very particularly interesting. And this news, of course, from what we have heard, we have got another great fight on our hands, another great bout that has now been officially confirmed. And apparently, this fight has been confirmed for that of June 5th, so somewhere during the summertime of this year. And I think that this is a very excellent fight. And of course, that is the fight between that of Devin Haney and Mr. George Kambosos. And I think that both fighters really have a lot to prove in this fight. I think that it's really a fantastic fight. And let me give Devin Haney a lot of credit overall for taking this fight. I'll also give George Kambosos a certain amount of credit for taking this fight. George Kambosos didn't seem super duper excited about taking the Devin Haney fight compared to some other fights, but I can somewhat understand his point because Devin Haney is almost someone like an Arasani Lara or Demetrius Bobo-Andre. He's someone that, even though if you were able to beat him, you would get a certain amount of credibility. He's not really usually number one on anyone's list overall to usually face off against because he's someone that can be a very decently high risk but very low reward. Now, if you believe that Devin Haney is as skilled as some of those other guys that I mentioned or not, that's up to you. But Devin Haney very clearly is decently talented. But I do think that George Kambosos would have rather had either the Ryan Garcia, Vasily Lomachenko, or the Gervonta Tank Davis fights because those would have been bigger money fights to him at least, or the Vasily Lomachenko fight. That would have been overall, in his mind, I believe, that would have been a fight to where not only, it would have been a very interesting matchup, but on top of that, if he were able to beat Vasily Lomachenko, he would have got a great amount of pound for pound medal because Vasily Lomachenko, of course, is still looked at as one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. And I agree to a degree. I can't have Lomachenko in my current crop right now of the other top five pound for pound fighters because he has no belts. And on top of that, the last big fight that you had, you ended up losing overall when it came down to it to, I believe, Mr. Teofimo Lopez. So I can't have you within my top five pound for pound. But at the end of the day, I would have Mr. Vasily Lomachenko low within my top 10 pound for pound list. But just to talk about the Devin Haney and George Kambosos matchup, I do think that it is a very interesting fight. I do think that it is a very interesting matchup. And both fighters, in my view, have a whole hell of a lot to prove in this fight. Basically, if you're Mr. George Kambosos, what do you have to prove in this fight? You pretty much have to prove that you do deserve those three belts overall that you ended up getting, which have kind of been passed around within these past few years. Because in my view, in that Teofimo Lopez fight, even though I thought George Kambosos put on a very decent fight, and I do think that he certainly deserved to win that fight, I thought that Teofimo Lopez was very one-dimensional in that fight. I don't think all in all that he fought very well. And I think that a certain amount of the other channels believe that as well. Whether they say that they predicted George Kambosos to win or not, you can tell that some of these other channels, they thought that Teofimo more than likely, that he had a chance to lose to George Kambosos, but that more than likely Teofimo was the more talented fighter. And I think that that was a pretty good example that Teofimo, at least in certain categories, he's the more naturally gifted boxer, but overall he did not use his intelligence. He overall did not have that great of a game plan. He certainly did not have a multitude of game plans for that fight, and that's the reason why he lost. And I think that that's going to haunt Teofimo for a very long time. Unfortunately for Mr. Teofimo Lopez, it may make him overall never the same fighter ever again. So we'll see all in all what happens. But anyways, just to speak about George Kambosos, what George Kambosos has to prove in this fight is that he's not another Jermaine Taylor, that he's not another Andrew Ruiz Jr., that he's not overall another Buster Douglas. And a certain amount of people may not, agree necessarily with those comparisons. But basically, what am I saying about Mr. George Kambosos? Basically, what he has to show is that he's not a one-hit wonder. He has to show all in all that he actually does belong in the top ranks, because it's not only me that believes this, but a certain amount of other people believe this as well. There's a certain amount of people that don't believe that George Kambosos would beat any of the other A-grade fighters within that division. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not sure if he would either. If he was to go up against Vasily Lomachenko, I probably would favor Vasily Lomachenko. If he were to go up against Gervonta Tank Davis, I certainly would favor Gervonta Tank Davis. If he were to even go up against Ryan Garcia, now that would be a very interesting fight, just because Ryan Garcia, you can tell that he has a lot of physical gifts and a lot of physical talent, but you can tell all in all that he's still very, very young and inexperienced at this point in time. So we'll see all in all where he goes from here, even though I do think that he has promise. But I think that Kambosos, when it comes down to it, even though I think that he's a very decent boxer and he showed me that he has even more skill than what I once thought in that Teofimo Lopez fight, he is going to have to prove overall to the boxing world that he's just not another Jermaine Taylor, that he's just not someone all in all that ended up beating the man that beat the man, and then basically all in all he pretty much faded out. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening in this fight, or maybe someone like, if you want to compare it this way, another Carlos Baldomir, someone who ended up beating Zab Judah, someone who had great physical gifts and a decent skill set, but never used them to their full capacity as well as what they should have. And then all in all, basically they kind of fade out in some of the other bigger fights, at least from what I remember. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening. If you're Mr. Devin Haney, you basically have to prove all in all that now basically this is your shot. You have to prove that if your objective is to become the number one, fighter in that division, which of course is his goal when it comes down to it, you really have to show up in this fight. And both fighters, all in all, they really both have to show up in this fight. I think that this fight is going to be very particularly interesting. And the reason why I say that is because both fighters, in my view, actually have a very similar style. Both fighters, when it comes down to it, they seem overall to fight a little bit on the back foot, be a little bit defensive. They have decent head movement when it comes down to it, but they do have holes in their defense. If you take a look at George Kambosos in some of his bigger fights, like against Mickey Bay, Lee Selby, Teofimo Lopez especially, he's not bad. He certainly actually has very decent feet. He has very decent head movement. But his defense, I would not classify as a great. He does get hit a little bit more overall from my liking or for my liking. Devin Haney is very similar as well. Now, in the Jorge Linares fight, for example, he ended up getting hit at the end of that fight. I did not really think that was that big of a deal because it was very clear to me that Devin Haney, in my view, that he was trying to compare his performance to that of Vasily Lomachenko's, and that he more than likely was trying to knock him out, overall, kind of like what Vasily Lomachenko did. He was not successful because I don't think that Devin Haney, all in all, not only is not the boxer that Vasily Lomachenko is, I don't think that he is the athlete that Vasily Lomachenko is. That's not me saying that maybe Devin Haney would not have a chance against Lomachenko because of his height and reach and the skill set that he has. But at the end of the day, I do believe that Vasily Lomachenko is a better fighter, in my view, than what a Devin Haney would be, but we'll see later on. But anyways, when it comes down to it, Devin Haney, this is going to be a very interesting fight because he's not always necessarily the most defensively responsible either. If you take a look at that fight against Jojo Diaz, even though I thought Devin Haney clearly won the fight, even though he clearly overall, won the majority of the rounds, he won like 9 or 8 rounds, in my opinion, in that fight. Most people will tell you that Devin Haney dominated that fight. I don't know if you really would call that a domination. Clearly on the scorecards, he ended up dominating when it came down to it, and you had no other choice but to give it to Devin Haney. But there was a few times where he ended up getting hurt in that fight. There was a few times, actually quite a bit of times, where overall he ended up getting caught. These channels, for example, like Dante's Boxing Nation or some of these other channels, they always talk about Canelo Alvarez overall, especially when he faces these high-tier, competition guys. They always say, oh, well, Canelo, he has so many holes in his defense. He gets hit like this, he gets hit like that. But there's never any mention of Devin Haney or someone like that when he ends up getting hit. Because if you really take a look at Devin Haney in some of his bigger fights, which is really hard to gauge because he's really only been in 2 decent fights in his career, and one of those being the Jojo Diaz fight, he gets hit a lot more often than what people overall would believe. That's why I say, these narratives, when certain people say, oh, well, these certain fighters, and don't get me wrong, do certain fighters maybe avoid certain black fighters overall? You certainly can allege that. But don't just say all in all that, fighter all in all, just because they're this black American fighter, that they're always on the Floyd Mayweather Jr. level. We can't necessarily compare it like that. Now, Devin Haney is what is known, in my opinion, as a little bit of a slickster. So is George Kambosos. That's why this fight, in my view, is going to be very particularly interesting. But we'll see all in all what ends up happening. I think that both fighters have a decent chance. I more than likely am going to favor Devin Haney in this matchup. I think that all in all that he is going to have the slight athleticism advantage over George Kambosos. I think all in all that he's going to have the speed advantage. I think all in all that, he's going to probably have the better game plan. And I think all in all that Devin Haney, that more than likely he's probably going to face George Kambosos on the back foot. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up coming forward, but I believe that more than likely Devin Haney is going to try to outbox him on the back foot. And unfortunately, George Kambosos' defense may be a little bit more leaky than what a Devin Haney's defense would be, but we'll see all in all what ends up happening. I would not be shocked, I would not be surprised if either or fighter ended up winning this fight, and whoever wins this fight, in my view, they will be on my top 10 pound for pound list. I don't have either or of these fighters on my top 10 pound for pound list at the current moment in time. But we'll overall see what happens. And like I said, once again, let me give credit to Mr. Devin Haney. Because Devin Haney could have been another Demetrius Boo Andrade. He could have been another Jamal Charlo. He could have been someone basically said that, oh, I want all these big fights. Poor me. No one will fight me. And then basically, he gets presented an opportunity. And then basically he declines it. And there were a certain amount of, if you want to call it lopsided demands from Mr. George Kambosos Jr., but you expect that. It is what it is, because George Kambosos at the current moment in time, he pretty much is the A side. He's the person that has the rest of the belts. He's the person that just beat the man. He's the person that right now, he has a great amount of the people behind him. So, of course, you expect him to put in a certain amount of other things. That doesn't really surprise me. I don't think that there's really any problem with that. This fight apparently is going to be in Australia. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening. That may give George Kambosos a little bit of a better chance to win that fight against Devin Haney, but we'll see what happens. In my view, if you were just going to ask me early, what does George Kambosos have to do to beat Devin Haney? And vice versa, what does Devin Haney have to do to beat George Kambosos? Well, in my view, Devin Haney, more than likely what he has to do is stick his jab out there, pull that, throw that right hand down the pipe. I noticed that in that Teofimo Lopez fight that George Kambosos, he's somewhat vulnerable to right hands. He does not like to keep his hands up a lot of the times. If George Kambosos, overall, if I were to give advice to him, I would say sharpen up your defense. But unfortunately, I just don't know if his defense is going to be sharp enough in that fight. But we'll see all in all what ends up happening. In my view, George Kambosos, sometimes you may want to fight on the back foot with Devin Haney. That may not always be the worst idea. Get a left hook in there, get a right cross in there, establish that jab, go to the body, go to the head, use your quick feet, because George Kambosos actually has very decent feet. I don't think that his feet are bad at all. I think all in all that his movement actually is very good. The main problem, like I said, with George Kambosos, once again, is that defense. It's very, very leaky. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening. It's also going to be very interesting to see all in all what channels or what people end up giving Devin Haney credit for this win if he beats George Kambosos and Vasily Lomachenko. Because we all know what they usually allege with fighters overall, like a Canelo Alvarez or someone else of a sort of fighter that they may not like. They always say that they're facing the C-grade Caucasian fighters or, the not-so-elite Caucasian fighters. So I wonder, all in all, if Devin Haney, if he will be propelled overall in pound-for-pound status by defeating two white boys. Because we all know what they would be saying with Canelo Alvarez, but it is what it is. But, of course, in all rationality and in all logic and objectivity, for those of us, of course, that aren't trying to pull a narrative, if he ends up defeating George Kambosos and Vasily Lomachenko, Devin Haney may very well be one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world of boxing, or at least one of the top 6, top 7. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening. But it'll be very particularly interesting. And if Devin Haney or George Kambosos end up winning this fight, of course you have the Gervonta Tank Davis fights out there. You have the Ryan Garcia fights. Maybe if you want to move up to 140, there's Josh Taylor, Regis Prograis, Jose Ramirez, a few others out there. And of course that's not even talking about Montana Love or some of the other upcoming ones. It's going to be very interesting to see who the winner of this fight is. It's going to be very interesting to see what the future holds for both of these gentlemen. But we'll see all in all what ends up happening. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see all in all what ends up happening. But from what I hear, this fight is going to happen June 5th. Should be very particularly interesting. And we'll see overall what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.